Okay, so for this portion of the presentation, this is when we're actually going to get into the mechanisms of producing the ATP and then producing the nucleic acids and producing more ATP. So this is the worksheet that I picked from glycolysis to really explain what's going on here and how we're getting ATP. I'm not going to go over all the worksheets from all the labs we had over the last few weeks just because we only have about 5 minutes for this presentation, but these are the ones I hand selected that I feel like are most relevant to the prompt, so let's get into it. So here we have the worksheet for glycolysis. We're starting up here with glucose. With the help of hexokinase, glucose is converted to glucose 6-phosphate. Here are all the structures, as everybody knows, because you also completed this worksheet. So glucose 6-phosphate is going to be converted to fructose 6-phosphate with the help of phosphoglucose isomerase, and that's going to be converted to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate by phosphofructokinase. So next we're going to have aldolase, which is going to produce DAP and G3P. G3P is going to be the one that continues on to form 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, and that's going to be converted to 3-phosphoglycerate with the help of phosphoglycerate kinase. Next, that's taken to 2-phosphoglycerate with phosphoglycerate mutase. Then enolase turns that into phosphoenolpyruvate. Finally, the last step, we have pyruvate kinase, which makes pyruvate. Now, everybody knows by now that pyruvate is the end product of glycolysis, but in order to ultimately get ATP production, this is very important. So our next worksheet here is when we had, let's get this a little closer. So our next worksheet here is the citric acid cycle. So that pyruvate is going to be converted into something that can enter the citric acid cycle, which, as we all know by now, is acetyl coenzyme A. So acetyl coenzyme A enters the citric acid cycle, goes through all these steps, and you all filled this out, so I'll spare you going through the citric acid cycle, but just keep this in mind when we move on to the next step in cellular respiration, which is the electron transport chain. So basically here we have complex 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what's happening as this NADH is converted to NAD+, and the FADH2 is converted to FAD, it's basically pumping out hydrogen ions into the intermembrane space. So these hydrogen ions are going to be very important in terms of actually producing the ATP. So moving on to the next worksheet is the ATP synthase. So this was part of the prompt in discussing this, and it's very important, actually probably the most important in terms of producing ATP. So from our electron transport chain, we know that all the hydrogen ions were up here floating around in the intermembrane space. Basically, this structure here is the ATP synthase. It's going to take those hydrogen ions, pump them through, and as they're pumped through, that is what is converting ADP to ATP. So this happens many, many times. We get about 36 ATP produced from this ATP synthase. So this was a long process, and there is many steps involved in producing ATP, but it's important to know all these processes: glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, the electron transport chain, because that's what's going to ultimately lead us to this ATP production, because without all those steps, then we would not get this ATP, because the products of each process have to be converted, and that's in order to make all the ATP. So that is how we get ATP from cellular respiration. So now we're basically going to go into the nucleic acid production, and that was our lab from last week. So our lab from last week from the nucleic acid production, here I noticed in the prompt that it said we were starting with CO2, so this is the worksheet that I picked out to go over. So from the CO2, it's basically converted to carbamic acid and ultimately carbon monoaspartate. And also here we get orotate. So that orotate that's produced from all this up here is right here now, and it's going to ultimately produce uridylate. And then from PRPP, this is a very important step down here because it's going to go through all these steps and finally give us inositate. So inositate is what's going to be the main takeaway from this nucleic acid worksheet in terms of producing ATP. So now we're going to move on to my last worksheet that I wanted to work through. So keep in mind here the inositate that we had formed. So now, let me just turn this way. We have inositate down here. From our previous worksheet, we saw how that was formed. It's going to go through all these steps. So here we have the GTP to GDP, we have fumarate, we have AMP, and the kinase. So basically all these steps are ultimately going to give us ATP. Up here on this worksheet, we had the uridylate, and that's going to give us these products, but in terms of the prompt, I'm just focusing on this half down here because that's what's going to give us ATP. So ultimately, we've went over how to get ATP from the cellular respiration, but also how nucleic acid formation is also forming ATP. So ATP is obviously very important for a lot of cellular functions and just a lot of processes that are going on in our body. So this whole worksheet and this whole board was really important in really understanding how that ATP is produced.